Welcome to the Cozy Storytime, your peaceful space to unwind and relax. Before we start, make sure to subscribe and like the video for more cozy stories every night. So, where are you watching it from? And what are you doing right now? I hope you enjoyed this story. Night has fallen. The sky above Hogwarts shimmers softly, stars hanging like tiny specks of magic glowing in the darkness. A gentle breeze whispers through the air, carrying echoes of the past and a story that still lingers within the ancient castle's halls. Close your eyes, listen to the night, and let yourself drift into the mystery of time. A single experiment, one small misstep, pulls a wizard beyond the boundaries that should never be crossed. And in the midst of it all, long-buried secrets begin to unravel. This is a story of losing time, of a journey that changes everything, and of a traveler searching for his place in the world. Breathe deeply, let yourself relax, and prepare to be carried away into a tale that will take you beyond time itself. Curiosity has always been my greatest strength and my greatest weakness. Ever since I stepped foot in Hogwarts, the vastness of magic and the secrets hidden within its ancient walls have fascinated me. It wasn't enough to simply attend classes and learn spells that had been practiced for centuries. I wanted to uncover the unknown, the magic buried in forgotten books and whispered about in the dead of night. That was how I found myself in the restricted section of the library, fingers trembling with excitement as I traced the golden letters on the spine of an ancient tome, Chronomagia, the forbidden weavings of time. It wasn't easy getting my hands on the book. The restricted section was heavily guarded by enchantments, and Madame Pants was always lurking nearby, her sharp eyes missing nothing. But with the help of a well-timed disillusionment charm and a little luck, I had managed to slip it into my bag and retreat to my dormitory undetected. There, under the dim glow of my wand, I read page after page, enthralled by the complex theories of time manipulation. Time turners were the most well-known form of time magic, but according to the book, they were merely crude tools compared to the lost art of temporal invocation. Unlike time turners, which allowed brief visits to the past with strict limitations, temporal invocation was said to allow a deeper, more fluid connection with time itself. The incantation described in the book, Tempus Evocare, was rumored to open a rift, a window into different moments in time. But the author had also warned, time does not appreciate being bent to the will of mere mortals. Those who toy with it must be prepared for the consequences. I should have heeded that warning. Eager to test the spell, I shared my discovery with two of my closest friends, Ethan and Mara. They were hesitant at first, but like me, they had an insatiable thirst for knowledge. The idea of being able to witness moments from the past, to glimpse the history of Hogwarts with our own eyes, was too tempting to resist. So, we made a plan. That night, we sneaked into an abandoned classroom on the 7th floor. The room had been in use for decades, the wooden desks covered in dust and the air thick with the scent of old parchment. We pushed the desks aside, creating an open space in the middle of the room. I placed the book on the floor, its yellow pages open to the incantation. "Are you sure about this?" Mara whispered, her green eyes flickering with uncertainty. "This book doesn't say anything about what happens if we do it wrong." "That's because it's never been properly recorded," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "We'll be careful. We're not trying to change anything, just look." Ethan exhaled slowly. "All right. But the second something feels wrong, we stop." I nodded and raised my wand. The incantation was long, the syllables twisting in my mouth as I spoke them. As I chanted, the temperature in the room dropped. A faint shimmer appeared in the air before us, like ripples on the surface of a still lake. The shimmer deepened, darkened, until it became a swirling vortex, an opening into something unknown. A thrill of excitement shot through me. It was working. The spell was actually working. But then, something changed. The vortex began to expand, the shimmering edges unraveling like fabric being torn apart. The force of it pulled at my robes, my hair whipping around my face. I tried to step back, but my feet wouldn't move. A sharp wind howled through the room, sending papers and dust flying in all directions. "Close it," Ethan shouted. "Something's wrong." I tried. I really did. I reversed the incantation, forcing the words out despite the panic rising in my chest. But the vortex didn't close. It widened, deepened. A force stronger than anything I had ever felt wrapped around me, dragging me forward. Mara screamed my name. Then everything went black. I felt as though I was being stretched, as though every fiber of my being was unraveling and reforming all at once. Time was not a river, as the book had described, but an ocean, and I was drowning in its endless depths. Flashes of moments, glimpses of things I did not understand, flickered before my eyes, figures in robes unlike any I had ever seen, torches lining stone corridors, voices speaking in tongues long forgotten. My head spun. My body ached. And then, silence. I opened my eyes to find myself lying on cold stone. The air smelled different, damp, earthy, ancient. The candlelight flickered in a way that felt wrong, as though the very energy of the place was different from the Hogwarts I knew. Pushing myself up, I looked around, my breath catching in my throat. This was still Hogwarts. But it wasn't my Hogwarts. The walls were older, rougher, the stone showing no signs of the repairs and enchantments that had been placed over the centuries. The torches burned with an eerie, bluish light. The hallway stretched before me, vast and empty, the echoes of my own breathing the only sound. My wand was still in my hand, but when I whispered Lumos, the glow it emitted was weaker than it should have been. I swallowed hard. Panic threatened to consume me, but I forced it down. I needed to stay calm. I needed to understand when I was. I turned a corner, my footsteps hesitant against the cold floor. The paintings on the walls were different, no moving figures, no friendly faces of former headmasters. Instead, they were filled with dark, stormy landscapes, unsettling and devoid of life. I tried to recall everything I had read in Chronomagia. If I had truly traveled back in time, there had to be a way to return. But the book had said nothing about how. I had to find someone who could tell me where I was, who could help me. But the idea of meeting anyone in this time, without knowing exactly when I had landed, sent a shiver down my spine. What if they saw me as a threat? What if I had landed in a time when Hogwarts was still being built, before students like me even existed? I forced myself to keep walking, my fingers gripping my wand so tightly that my knuckles ached. I needed a plan. I needed a sound, a soft rustling like fabric against stone. My heart pounded. I turned my head sharply, wand raised. And then I saw her. A figure standing at the end of the corridor, bathed in the cold glow of the torches. Her long, silver blonde hair cascaded over her shoulders, her wide, pale eyes staring at me with a mixture of curiosity and understanding. Luna Lovegood. But how? Before I could speak, she smiled in that dreamy way of hers. "Oh," she said, tilting her head. "You are here too. I was wondering when you'd arrive." I stared at her, my mind racing. She wasn't supposed to be here. Neither was I. And that was when I realized something had gone terribly, terribly wrong. I stared at Luna, my mind struggling to process the impossibility of her presence. My heart was still pounding from the overwhelming realization that I had somehow traveled to the past, and yet here she was, standing calmly in the dimly lit corridor as if she had simply been waiting for me. "Luna?" My voice came out hoarse, barely more than a whisper. She smiled in that familiar, serene way of hers. "Yes, it's me," she said, taking a few slow steps forward. "Though I imagine you weren't expecting to see me here." "Expecting?" I repeated, shaking my head. "Luna, how are you here? What is this place? When are we?" She tilted her head, her gaze drifting toward the flickering torches lining the hallway. "That's a complicated question," she mused. "But I suppose the simplest answer is that we're somewhere Hogwarts used to be. A long time ago, by the look of things." I swallowed hard. "So it's true. I actually traveled back in time." She nodded. "Yes. And so did I." I opened my mouth, then closed it again. My mind felt like it was spinning. "But how?" I finally managed to ask. I was performing a spell. An incantation I found in a book. But you weren't with me, Luna. You shouldn't be here." She studied me thoughtfully for a moment. "No, I wasn't with you," she admitted. "But I was doing something similar. A little experiment of my own." I frowned. "You were trying to manipulate time?" Luna's gaze drifted past me, her expression dreamy yet focused. "Not quite the way you did. I wasn't using a spell. I was studying the way time moves in places where it's weaker, where it's stretched." She looked back at me. "I think I got caught in the same current as you." I exhaled, rubbing my temple. None of this made sense. The spell I had used had been incredibly complex, something no ordinary student should have been able to perform. And yet, somehow, Luna, without a spell, had ended up here too. "So you're saying this was a coincidence?" Luna smiled. "I don't believe in coincidences," she said simply. That wasn't exactly comforting. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "All right. If we're both here, then we need to figure out how to get back. Do you know when we are? What time period this is?" Luna glanced around the hallway. "I have a few guesses," she murmured. "The architecture is older than what we're used to. The torches burn differently, no modern enchantments. And the paintings." She gestured toward the nearest portrait, which depicted an eerie, storm-ridden landscape. "They don't move." She was right. At first, I had thought the portraits were simply empty, but now I realized they weren't enchanted yet. The living, moving paintings that filled Hogwarts in my time had not yet been created. This has to be centuries ago, I murmured, my stomach twisting. Maybe even before the founder's time. Possibly, Luna agreed. But we won't know for sure unless we find someone who can tell us. That thought made my skin prickle. I had no idea who or what we might find here. Yet this was a time long before modern Hogwarts, then there was no telling what kind of magic ruled these halls. Do you think it's safe? I asked, my voice hushed. Luna gave me a small, knowing smile. Do you think we have a choice? I sighed. She was right. If we wanted answers, we had to move forward. We began walking down the corridor, our footsteps eerily loud against the stone floor. The air was heavy with the scent of old parchment and melted wax, and with every step, I felt the weight of the unknown pressing down on me. The castle was different here, not just in its structure, but in its feel. Hogwarts had always had a certain energy to it, something alive and pulsing beneath the surface. But this version of Hogwarts, it felt dormant, ancient, yet strangely untouched. I glanced at Luna as we walked. She moved with the same airy grace she always did, her expression calm, as if she was merely strolling through the corridors of our own time. I wished I could share her serenity. How are you so calm? I finally asked. She blinked at me. Why wouldn't I be? I almost laughed. Because we're trapped in the past with no idea how to get back. Luna tilted her head. That's true, she admitted. But panicking won't change that. I sighed. I envied her ability to accept things so easily. My mind, on the other hand, was racing with a million questions, each more terrifying than the last. As we turned a corner, a gust of cold air swept through the hallway. I shivered, pulling my cloak tighter around me. The wind carried a faint sound with it, a whisper, distant yet unmistakable. I froze. Did you hear that? Luna nodded. Yes. The whispering grew louder. It wasn't one voice, but several, murmuring words I couldn't understand. The sound seemed to be coming from the end of the corridor, where a massive wooden door stood slightly ajar. Luna and I exchanged a glance. Neither of us spoke, but we both understood. We had to see what was inside. Slowly, cautiously, I stepped forward, my heart pounding. I reached out and pushed the door open a little wider, just enough for us to slip through. The room was vast, lined with towering bookshelves that stretched to the ceiling. In the center stood a massive stone pedestal, and atop it, a single, glowing hourglass. The whispers swirled around the room like an invisible current emanating from the object itself. I swallowed hard. Luna, what is that? She stared at the hourglass, her expression unusually serious. I think, she murmured, it's a relic of time. I felt a chill run down my spine. A what? Luna stepped closer, her eyes locked onto the shimmering glass. There are artifacts in the world that aren't bound by normal magical laws, she explained. Objects that carry pieces of time itself. They're rare, but incredibly powerful. My mouth felt dry. And what happens if we touch it? Luna smiled slightly. Well, that depends. It might help us. Or it might make things worse. I exhaled sharply. Great. That's comforting. Luna reached out, fingers hovering just above the hourglass. We won't know unless we try. I wanted to protest, to suggest we think this through more carefully, but before I could say anything, Luna touched the hourglass. The moment her fingers brushed the glass, the entire room shuddered. The whispers became a deafening roar, and the torches flared violently, casting wild shadows against the walls. The air rippled, and suddenly, I wasn't standing in the same room anymore. Everything twisted, time itself folding in on itself. And then, just as quickly as it had started, silence. I blinked, my vision clearing. The room was gone. Luna was gone. And I was standing somewhere else entirely. The air around me was thick, heavy with the scent of rain-soaked stone and something else, something ancient. My head throbbed as I tried to steady myself, the dizziness from whatever had just happened still lingering in my bones. Luna was gone. The library was gone. And I was standing in a place that felt wrong. The walls here were darker, rougher, as if they had been carved straight from the mountains rather than built brick by brick. The torches that lined the corridor burned a deep, unnatural blue, their flames flickering in eerie silence. The floor beneath me wasn't the polished stone of Hogwarts as I knew it, but uneven rock, as though I were inside a cave rather than a castle. I took a shaky breath. Where was I? Or rather, when was I? Luna? I called out cautiously, my voice echoing down the long, empty hallway. There was no answer. Panic started creeping up my spine. I was alone, stranded in an unknown time, and I had no idea how to get back. Stay calm. Luna had been holding the hourglass when it happened. If she was transported somewhere else, maybe she was still nearby, maybe she had landed in a different part of the castle. If this was Hogwarts. I gripped my wand tightly and took a hesitant step forward. The corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, the blue torches casting long, unnatural shadows against the walls. I chose a direction at random and began walking, my heart beat loud in my ears. The silence was unnerving. Hogwarts was never this quiet, even at night. There was always something, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional creak of a stairway shifting, the low murmurs of the castle itself as its magic breathed through the halls. But here? Nothing. No footsteps. No whispering paintings. Just the eerie flicker of blue fire and the sound of my own breathing. After what felt like an eternity, the corridor opened up into a vast chamber. I hesitated at the threshold, my grip on my wand tightening. The room was massive, lined with towering stone pillars, each etched with symbols I didn't recognize. The walls were adorned with ancient tapestries, nothing like the ones in my time. Instead of depicting battles or historical events, these were woven with strange, shifting patterns that seemed to move while I looked away. And in the center of the room stood a figure. A man. He was tall, his long robes made of deep emerald fabric that shimmered unnaturally in the torchlight. His hair was dark, falling in waves past his shoulders, and his eyes, when they locked onto mine, were sharp, calculating. I froze. Whoever this was, he did not belong to my time. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy with something I couldn't name. Then, finally, he tilted his head slightly and spoke. You do not belong here. His voice was smooth, composed, but there was an edge to it, an underlying curiosity laced with suspicion. I swallowed hard. I know, I admitted. I don't know how I got here. The man studied me for a moment before taking a slow step forward. You are not one of my students. That sent a shiver down my spine. One of his students? This wasn't just a wizard from the past. He was someone who had authority here. Someone who considered himself part of Hogwarts. My breath caught in my throat as realization dawned. Salazar Slytherin. The name crashed through my mind like a thunderclap. It had to be him. The way he carried himself, the way he studied me with sharp, assessing eyes, it all fit. I was standing in the presence of one of Hogwarts' founders. Salazar Slytherin was alive. And he was looking at me as if he was trying to decide whether I was worth keeping alive. I forced myself to stand tall, to meet his gaze without faltering. I couldn't afford to look weak. I'm a student, I said carefully, choosing my words with precision. But not from here. Not from this time. Something flickered in his eyes. Interest. Not from this time, he repeated. He glanced at my wand, his gaze lingering on it for a moment before he stepped even closer. Time magic, then? I nodded. Yes. He didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked intrigued. As if he had expected something like this to happen. His lips curved into a faint smile. Fascinating. I wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a very bad thing. You should not be here, he continued, his voice softer now. But since you are, I suppose we should make use of it. I stiffened. Make use of it? Salazar's gaze darkened slightly. You are proof that time can be manipulated, he said. That it can be bent, twisted, perhaps even controlled. I did not like where this was going. I don't know how it happened, I admitted. It wasn't intentional. Perhaps not, he mused, but it happened. And that alone is enough. I didn't like the way he was looking at me now, like I was something to be studied, dissected. My heart pounded against my ribs. I need to get back, I said firmly. I don't belong in this time. Salazar tilted his head slightly. And yet, you are here. I clenched my jaw. If you know anything about time magic, about how to send me back, please, tell me. He studied me for a long moment, as if deciding whether or not I was worth his time. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he turned away. There are ways, he admitted, but none that are simple. He walked toward the center of the chamber, his fingers trailing lightly over the symbols carved into the stone pillars. Time is not meant to be meddled with. It resists those who try to control it. I swallowed. Then how do I undo this? Salazar was silent for a moment. Then he turned back to me, his expression unreadable. That depends, he said. How far are you willing to go? I hesitated. What do you mean? He stepped closer, his emerald robes brushing against the floor. Magic of this nature has a cost, he murmured. A price must always be paid. A chill ran through me. I didn't know what he meant by that, but I had a feeling I wasn't going to like the answer. Before I could speak again, the air in the chamber suddenly shifted. A ripple, like the aftershock of an earthquake, pulsed through the room. The torches flickered violently, and a strange hum filled the air. Salazar's expression darkened. Something is wrong. I barely had time to react before a voice I recognized, echoed through the chamber. There you are. I spun around. And there, standing at the entrance of the chamber, was Luna Lovegood. But she wasn't alone. Beside her, gripping his wand tightly, was Harry Potter. Luna? My voice barely left my throat. She stood at the entrance of the chamber, her usual dreamy expression replaced by something more focused, more serious. Her eyes flicked between me and Salazar Slytherin, as if she had already assessed the situation before stepping in. And then there was him. Harry Potter. His wand was raised slightly, not quite in a defensive stance, but ready, just in case. His emerald green eyes, so much like his mother's, were locked onto Salazar Slytherin with barely concealed suspicion. I had no idea how he had gotten here, how either of them had. But for the first time since arriving in this forgotten era, I felt something close to relief. You're here, I breathed. Luna smiled faintly. Of course, she said simply, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. Salazar Slytherin watched the interaction with keen interest. His sharp gaze flickered over Harry, studying him in a way that made my skin crawl. I could almost see the thoughts forming behind his eyes, the way he was evaluating him, measuring him. Another traveler, Salazar mused, his voice low. And another anomaly. Harry's grip on his wand tightened, but he didn't make a move. We're leaving, he said, his tone firm. All of us. Salazar's lips curled into something that was not quite a smile. Is that so? Harry took a step closer, positioning himself slightly in front of me. A protective gesture. We don't belong here, he said. And we won't be staying any longer than we have to. Salazar hummed thoughtfully, folding his hands behind his back. You speak as though time itself is something you can control. A dangerous assumption. Harry didn't blink. We're not here to argue philosophy. Salazar chuckled, a low, velvety sound that sent shivers down my spine. No, I suppose you aren't. Luna took a slow step forward, her gaze sweeping over the chamber. This place is strange, she murmured, almost to herself. Like a memory that hasn't faded properly. It doesn't feel entirely real. Salazar's expression shifted slightly at that, his gaze sharpening. You are more perceptive than you appear, he admitted. Luna smiled dreamily. People tell me that sometimes. Harry, however, wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. How do we get back? He demanded. Salazar regarded him for a long moment, then turned his attention back to me. I was just explaining to your friend that time magic is not so simple, he said. It is not a door one can simply walk through. It resists. It takes its due. Harry didn't waver. Then what's the price? Salazar tilted his head slightly. That depends. What are you willing to offer? The way he said it sent a chill through me. Harry's jaw tightened. We're not making deals. Salazar arched an eyebrow. Then you may find yourselves trapped here for longer than you wish. A heavy silence settled between us. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to speak. You know how to send us back, I said, watching him carefully. You wouldn't be so interested in us if you didn't. Salazar exhaled softly. You are not wrong, he admitted. There is a way, but it is not without risk. Harry's patience was wearing thin. Just tell us. Salazar studied him for a moment longer, then turned slightly, gesturing to the ancient symbols carved into the stone pillars. Time is a river, he said. It moves forward with great force, and those who fall into it are carried along its current. But there are places, fractures in the flow. Places where the past and present blur, where one may step from one age to another, if they know how. Luna's eyes sparkled with curiosity. A temporal fracture, she murmured. A wound in time. Salazar nodded. Precisely. And you three have already fallen through one. I frowned. But we didn't mean to. It wasn't intentional. No, Salazar agreed. But something pulled you through. Something powerful. And if you wish to return, you must find the source of that power. Harry narrowed his eyes. You're talking about the hourglass, aren't you? Salazar's lips twitched. Ah. So you are not entirely blind. My stomach twisted. We don't have it, I admitted. It disappeared when we were separated. Salazar hummed in thought. Then you must retrieve it. The hourglass is a relic of time itself. It holds the potential to bend the current, to realign your presence with your own era. Harry exhaled sharply. Where is it? Salazar's expression darkened slightly. That is the question, isn't it? A flicker of unease passed through me. You don't know? Salazar gave me a pointed look. Magic such as this does not simply vanish. If it has left your grasp, then it has been taken. The words sent a cold prickle down my spine. Luna tilted her head. Who would take something like that? Salazar's eyes glinted with something unreadable. Someone who understands its value. A heavy silence fell over the chamber. Harry's grip on his wand remained firm. Then we find it, he said. And we leave. Salazar watched him for a moment, then inclined his head slightly. A wise decision. I hesitated. And what about you? Salazar's gaze met mine, and something flickered there, something unreadable. Time has already decided my fate, he murmured. It is your fate that remains uncertain. A shiver ran down my spine. Harry wasn't interested in cryptic words. Come on, he said, turning to me and Luna. We need to move before we run out of time. Luna nodded. Yes. The longer we stay, the harder it will be to leave. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. Salazar Slytherin was still watching me as we turned to leave, his expression unreadable. And as we stepped back into the dark corridors of ancient Hogwarts, I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something we didn't. The air inside the ancient corridors of Hogwarts felt heavier now, charged with something unseen. Magic? Time itself? I wasn't sure. All I knew was that every step I took sent a shiver up my spine, as if I were walking through a world that wasn't entirely real. Harry moved ahead of me, his wand held at his side but ready. Luna walked beside me, her expression calm, but her eyes flickered with quiet intensity. I could tell she was thinking about what, I wasn't sure. Salazar Slytherin's words echoed in my mind. The hourglass has been taken. By who? And why? Luna's voice broke the silence. I think I know where it might be. Harry slowed his steps but didn't turn to face her. Where? Luna tilted her head as if listening to something only she could hear. Not where. Who? I frowned. What do you mean? She glanced at me, her blue eyes seeming almost translucent in the flickering torchlight. There's someone else here. Someone who doesn't belong. A chill ran through me. How do you know that? Harry asked warily. Luna's gaze flicked to the walls, to the air itself. Because the castle is whispering. I didn't ask what that meant. I had known Luna long enough to trust her instincts, no matter how odd they sounded. Harry finally turned to face her, his brow furrowed. If someone else is here, then they must have been caught in the same time fracture as us. Or, Luna said lightly, they created it. The idea was unsettling. Then we're not just looking for the hourglass, I muttered. We're looking for whoever took it. Harry nodded. And we'd better do it fast. The three of us moved deeper into the castle. The further we went, the stranger it felt. The architecture shifted subtly, walls that should have been there weren't, and passageways twisted in ways that made no logical sense. It was Hogwarts, but not the Hogwarts we knew. Luna stopped suddenly. It's here. Harry and I exchanged a look before turning back to her. What's here? I asked. Luna pointed to an archway at the end of the hall. Beyond it, a set of heavy wooden doors stood slightly ajar. A pale blue light flickered from within. We approached cautiously. Harry raised his wand. Lumos. The chamber beyond the doors was circular, its stone walls covered in more of those shifting, ancient tapestries. But it wasn't the room itself that made my stomach twist. It was the person standing in the center of it. A figure in dark robes, hunched slightly over something held in their hands. The hourglass. The light from the torches cast eerie shadows across the chamber, but as we stepped closer, the figure slowly turned. And I felt the breath leave my lungs. He was old, far older than any professor I'd ever seen at Hogwarts. His skin was weathered, his long beard streaked with gray and silver. His eyes were sunken, dark, but there was a sharpness to them that sent a bolt of unease through me. He looked at us, his fingers tightening around the hourglass. So, he murmured, his voice rough and deep, you finally found me. Harry didn't lower his wand. Who are you? The old man chuckled, a dry, brittle sound. Who do you think I am, Harry Potter? I felt the hair on my arms rise. Harry's stance stiffened slightly. How do you know my name? The man's lips curled into a faint smile. Because I have been waiting for you. Silence stretched between us. Luna took a slow step forward. You're from our time, aren't you? The man inclined his head. I am. Harry didn't lower his wand. Then why are you here? And why do you have that? He gestured toward the hourglass. The man exhaled. Because time has been unraveling for longer than you realize. I felt a cold weight settle on my stomach. Unraveling? The man's fingers traced the rim of the hourglass. The fracture that pulled you here wasn't an accident, he murmured. It was a consequence. a symptom of something much larger. Harry took another step forward. Explain. The old man watched him for a moment before sighing. Magic is not infinite, he said. It can be stretched, manipulated, but every action has a price. The more we tamper with it, the more fragile it becomes. Luna nodded slowly, like pulling at loose threads in a tapestry. The man smiled faintly. Precisely. Harry's grip on his wand didn't ease. So what does that have to do with us? The man's expression darkened. Because you are part of the tapestry now. You fell through one of those loose threads. I swallowed hard. So how do we fix it? The man studied us. You must return to your own time before the fracture becomes permanent. I didn't like the sound of that. And if we don't? The old man's gaze turned grim. Then you will fade. A chill shot down my spine. Harry's expression hardened. Then we don't have a choice. The man nodded. No, you don't. Luna tilted her head. You haven't told us your name. The man's eyes flickered slightly, and for a moment, something passed over his expression. Hesitation? Regret? Then, finally, he spoke. My name is Eldrick Hawthorne. The name meant nothing to me. Harry, however, stiffened slightly. Hawthorne, he repeated. I've heard that name before. Eldrick smiled faintly. You should have. I was once a scholar of time magic. Luna's gaze sharpened slightly. And now you're trapped here. Eldrick exhaled, a long, slow breath. Yes. A heavy silence filled the room. Harry looked at the hourglass in Eldrick's hands. We need that. Eldrick's fingers tightened around it. I know. I didn't like the way he said that. You're not planning on giving it to us, are you? I asked wearily. Eldrick's eyes darkened. I will, he murmured. But only if you do something for me first. Of course. Harry let out a sharp breath. And what exactly do you want? Eldrick's gaze burned into us. I need you to take me with you. The words hit like a physical weight. I glanced at Harry, but his expression was unreadable. Luna was the one who spoke first. That's not how time travel works. Eldrick's grip on the hourglass tightened. It can be, if you're willing to take the risk. Harry's jaw clenched. What risk? Eldrick smiled. Letting time decide whether we live or vanish. A silence stretched between us. Harry exhaled sharply. We'll think about it. Eldrick simply nodded. Do not take too long. And as we stepped back from the chamber, the weight of our next decision pressed down on me like a storm waiting to break. The corridor outside Eldrick Hawthorne's chamber felt colder than before, as if the conversation we had just left behind had drained something from the air. Harry was walking ahead, his shoulders tense, the flickering torchlight casting sharp shadows across his face. Luna and I followed, our steps quieter, more uncertain. I could still feel the weight of Eldrick's words pressing on my chest. Take me with you. Harry stopped suddenly and turned to face us. His green eyes were stormy, filled with frustration and thought. This is a bad idea, he muttered. Luna tilted her head slightly. Which part? Harry let out a breath, running a hand through his already messy hair. All of it. We don't know anything about this man. He's been here for Merlin knows how long, studying time magic. He could be dangerous. He is dangerous, I admitted. But he's also our only chance at getting back. Harry shook his head. We don't need him. We just need the hourglass. Luna blinked at him. And how do you plan to take it from him? Harry hesitated. That was the problem, wasn't it? Eldrick held all the power here. Even if we wanted to leave him behind, we had no way of forcing him to hand over the hourglass. He doesn't belong in this time either, I said after a moment. Maybe helping him isn't the worst thing we could do. Harry sighed, rubbing his temple. And what if taking him back causes more problems? What if he was meant to stay here? Luna smiled faintly. Then time will find a way to correct itself. That didn't exactly make me feel better. I leaned against the cold stone wall, closing my eyes for a brief moment. Everything felt so overwhelming. A few days ago, I had been in our own Hogwarts, just another student. Now, I was stuck in an era where Salazar Slytherin walked the halls, discussing time fractures with a robed time scholar. Harry exhaled sharply. Fine. We'll play along for now. But the moment something feels wrong, we do this our way. Luna nodded as if she had already expected that answer. And so, with reluctant steps, we made our way back to the chamber. Eldrick was exactly where we left him, standing in the center of the room, cradling the hourglass like it was something precious. His expression was unreadable as he looked up at us. You've made a decision. Harry crossed his arms. We'll take you with us. But the moment things start going wrong, we'll do whatever it takes to fix it. Even if that means leaving you behind. Eldrick's lips curled into a knowing smile. Fair enough. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Luna took a step forward. How does it work? Eldrick traced the edge of the hourglass with a finger. This artifact is one of the few objects capable of manipulating time's natural resistance. It allows for controlled travel, but only under specific conditions. Harry's gaze narrowed. And what conditions are those? Eldrick's smile faded slightly. It requires an anchor. I frowned. An anchor? Eldrick nodded. Something that ties you to the time you belong to. It stabilizes the transition and ensures that time doesn't, he hesitated, choosing his words carefully, tear you apart in the process. A heavy silence settled over the room. Luna's fingers brushed over the pocket of her robe, and she tilted her head. Like a personal object from our time? Eldrick studied her for a moment, then nodded. Yes, but not just any object. It must hold meaning. Time magic is connected to intent, to the way of memory. The stronger the connection, the more stable the journey. Harry exhaled sharply. Great. And what happens if we don't have an anchor? Eldrick's expression darkened. Then you may not end up where you intend. The words sent a cold prickle down my spine. All right, I said, trying to focus. So we find something from our time that matters to us. That should be easy, right? Luna's expression turned thoughtful. Not as easy as you think. We didn't exactly bring anything personal with us when we fell through the fracture. My stomach twisted at the realization. She was right. We had nothing. No pictures, no keepsakes. Just the robes on our backs and the wands in our hands. Harry ran a hand through his hair again, clearly frustrated. There has to be something. Eldrick remained silent, watching us struggle with quiet amusement. Then Luna spoke. Our wands. Harry and I both turned to her. She held up her own wand, examining it as if seeing it for the first time. Our wands are bound to us. They've been with us for years. They carry our magic, our memories. They know us. Eldrick studied her with an intrigued expression. Interesting idea. And not incorrect. I felt a flicker of hope. So that could work? Eldrick inclined his head. It could, but there is still risk. The connection might not be strong enough. Or the magic might not respond the way we expect. Harry rolled his shoulders, determination setting in. Well, it's the best chance we have. Eldrick turned the hourglass slightly, the golden sand inside shifting, shimmering unnaturally. Then we must prepare. Once we activate the hourglass, the window to leave will be brief. If we hesitate, the fracture may close before we can pass through. No pressure, then. Luna nodded. We're ready. Harry and I exchanged one last glance before stepping closer. Eldrick positioned the hourglass between us, its globe casting strange shadows along the stone walls. He looked at each of us in turn. Focus on where you want to be. Not just Hogwarts, not just your time. See it. Feel it. I closed my eyes. I imagined the great hall filled with students, the warm candlelight flickering above. The sound of books rustling in the library. The scent of fresh parchment and ink. My Hogwarts. My time. A hum of magic crackled in the air. The hourglass in Eldrick's hands began to glow, the golden sand swirling faster, rising and falling like a restless storm. The chamber trembled slightly, a deep vibration resonating through the stone. And then, a sharp crack. The light from the hourglass flared, blindingly bright. The floor beneath us shifted. Not physically, but as if the world itself had just twisted out of alignment. I felt a force pulling at me, dragging me forward, backward, sideways. Time wasn't just moving, it was collapsing. Somewhere in the chaos, I heard Harry yell. Then, darkness. A weightless, endless void. And then, a sudden, sharp pull. The world snapped back into focus. I hit the ground hard, gasping as the impact knocked the air from my lungs. The scent of old parchment and candle wax filled my nose. I blinked. The familiar walls of the Hogwarts library surrounded me. For a moment, I couldn't move. Couldn't think. Then, a voice. Well, that was certainly interesting. I turned my head sharply, and there, standing among the bookshelves, was a very stunned-looking Professor McGonagall. The scent of parchment and candle wax filled my lungs as I struggled to push myself up. My head was still spinning, my body aching from the rough landing. My fingers curled against the cold stone floor of the Hogwarts library. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, the world around me still adjusting, still settling. And then, a voice, sharp, authoritative, and unmistakable. Well, that was certainly interesting. My breath caught. Slowly, I turned my head, and there, standing between the towering bookshelves, arms folded, with a stern expression that could freeze a raging hippogriff, was Professor McGonagall. I wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or terrified. Harry groaned beside me, pushing himself up, shaking his head as if trying to clear it. Luna was lying on her back, staring at the ceiling as if she found the architectural design utterly fascinating. Eldrick, however, was still on his knees, clutching the hourglass as though it was the only thing anchoring him to reality. Professor McGonagall's sharp gaze swept over each of us before finally settling on me. I would very much like an explanation, now. I opened my mouth, then promptly shut it. Where do I even begin? Harry, ever the Gryffindor, was the first to recover. He pushed himself up completely, dusted off his robes, and gave McGonagall a sheepish smile. Professor. Oh. It's a bit of a long story. Her eyebrows arched higher. I gathered as much. Her eyes flicked to Eldrick, narrowing with suspicion. And who, may I ask, is this? Eldrick, to his credit, managed to regain some composure. He stood up slowly, straightened his cloak, and met McGonagall's gaze with an air of calm confidence. Eldrick Hawthorne, madam. He inclined his head slightly. It is an honor to make your acquaintance. McGonagall's lips thinned. I do not recall ever hearing that name. Are you a student? Eldrick hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding smoothly, not exactly. That was the wrong answer. McGonagall's hand immediately went to her wand. I see. And why, exactly, do you have an hourglass radiating dangerous levels of magic in your possession? Luna sat up, brushing dust from her robes. Because without it, we wouldn't be here. McGonagall's eyes flicked to her, then back to me, as if waiting for a better explanation. I took a deep breath, finally finding my voice. Professor, I know this sounds impossible, but we were trapped. In the past. Somewhere around Salazar Slytherin's time. Her expression didn't change, but something in her gaze sharpened. The past. I nodded. It was an accident. A magical anomaly. We found Eldrick there. He's been stuck for centuries. He helped us get back. There was a long silence. Then McGonagall inhaled sharply and turned on her heel. Follow me. Now. We scrambled to our feet, exchanging nervous glances before hurrying after her. She led us through the winding corridors of Hogwarts, her robes billowing with every step. I had never seen her move this fast before. It was as if she was barely containing her urgency. We moved through the castle like ghosts, the usual chatter of students distant, muted, as if the very walls knew something was out of place. Harry finally broke the silence. Professor, where are we going? To the headmaster, she said curtly. I swallowed hard. Dumbledore. That was probably a good thing, but it still sent a wave of nervous energy through me. After what felt like an eternity, we arrived at the familiar stone gargoyle. McGonagall barely paused before uttering, "Sherbet lemon." The gargoyle leapt aside, and the staircase spiraled upward. As soon as we stepped into the headmaster's office, a sense of nostalgia mixed with unease washed over me. The familiar warm glow of candlelight, the endless trinkets and silver instruments clicking and whirring on their own, everything was just as I remembered it. And there, sitting behind his grand desk, his fingers steepled together, watching us with those twinkling blue eyes, was Professor Dumbledore. He took us all in, our disheveled robes, our tired faces, the hourglass still clutched in Eldric's hands. "Ah," Dumbledore said pleasantly. "Time travelers." My mouth fell open. Harry blinked. "Wait, you knew?" Dumbledore chuckled softly. A reasonable assumption, given the circumstances. His eyes landed on the hourglass, and his expression turned thoughtful. "A fascinating artifact. I believe we have much to discuss." McGonagall stepped forward, still looking deeply displeased. "Albus, they claim they've been to the time of Salazar Slytherin." Dumbledore's eyes twinkled with interest. "Is that so?" I hesitated, then nodded. "It's true. We were thrown into the past by a magical rupture. We barely managed to get back." Dumbledore hummed, then turned to Eldric. "And you, my mysterious guest. Would you care to introduce yourself?" Eldric straightened, meeting the headmaster's gaze with an air of cautious respect. "Eldric Hawthorne, scholar of time magic." Dumbledore studied him for a long moment. "Ah, a name long forgotten to history." Eldric's expression remained composed, but I saw the flicker of something in his eyes. Harry frowned. "You know about him?" Dumbledore smiled faintly. "I know of many things, Harry. Some have simply been misplaced in time." That wasn't exactly a no. Luna, who had been quiet for a while, spoke softly. "Professor, the time fracture. What caused it?" Dumbledore leaned back slightly, fingers tapping together. "A delicate question, Miss Lovegood." His gaze swept over us again. "I suspect you may already have part of the answer." I thought about everything that had happened. The warnings, the way the hourglass had reacted, the strange sensation of time resisting us. And then it hit me. "The past was never meant to hold us," I murmured. Dumbledore nodded approvingly. "Precisely." McGonagall sighed, rubbing her temple. "I don't suppose you have a way to ensure this never happens again, Albus?" Dumbledore's smile was enigmatic. "Time is a stubborn thing, Minerva, but it has a way of correcting itself." He turned back to us. "Now, I believe the real question is, what do we do with our guest?" Everyone's eyes turned to Eldric. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his features. He hesitated. "I don't belong here, do I?" "No," Dumbledore said kindly. "You belong somewhere. But whether that is here, or another point in time entirely, remains to be seen." Silence fell over the room, and I realized our journey wasn't quite over yet. Eldric stood there, his fingers still gripping the hourglass, his face an unreadable mask of contemplation. The candlelight in Dumbledore's office flickered softly, casting shifting shadows across the stone walls. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The weight of everything we had been through, being thrown into the past, facing Salazar Slytherin, nearly being lost in time forever, pressed down on me like an invisible force. Dumbledore, ever patient, finally broke the silence. "You stand at a crossroads, Mr. Hawthorne," he said, his voice kind but firm. You have traveled through time, witnessed the past, and now find yourself in a world that has long moved forward without you. Eldrick let out a slow breath, his thumb tracing the edge of the hourglass. I never thought I'd see a future beyond the walls of that castle, he admitted. His eyes met mine, then flickered to Luna and Harry. And yet, I don't know if I belong here either. McGonagall, who had been watching with a critical eye, folded her arms. It is an unusual predicament, to be sure. Harry stepped forward, his brow furrowed. But he helped us, he said. Without him, we wouldn't have made it back. There has to be some way to make this work. Dumbledore's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. A sentiment I admire, Harry. His gaze shifted to Eldrick again. But tell me, my dear traveler, if you had a choice, where would you wish to be? Eldrick's grip on the hourglass tightened. He hesitated. I don't know. Luna, who had been quiet up until now, suddenly tilted her head. You could stay, she said simply. Eldrick's eyes flickered to her. Stay? Here? In this time? Luna nodded. There's nothing saying you must belong to the past, is there? McGonagall pursed her lips. It's not that simple, Miss Lovegood. But Dumbledore, still watching Eldrick with those ever-wise eyes, merely folded his hands together. Perhaps not, he said. And yet, sometimes the most complicated of fates are the ones that bring about the most unexpected of journeys. I glanced between them all, my mind racing. If Eldrick stayed in this time, he would have to adapt. He'd have to live in a world where no one knew him, where the world had moved on without him. But if he tried to return to the past, could he even go back? Eldrick exhaled deeply, his eyes drifting to the enchanted hourglass in his hands. If I stay here, he murmured, I will be a man out of time. If I return, I will be a shadow of the past. Dumbledore nodded slowly. A paradox, indeed. Luna, thoughtful as ever, finally said, maybe the past has already let you go. Eldrick's breath hitched slightly. He looked at her, as if truly seeing her for the first time. What do you mean? She smiled, tilting her head. Time is like a river. It carries us forward, even if we try to swim against it. Maybe you were never meant to stay in the past. Maybe that's why the hourglass chattered the way it did. A slow realization dawned in Eldrick's expression. He glanced at the hourglass, at the shifting sands within. Dumbledore, ever perceptive, gave a small nod. Indeed, time has a way of guiding those who listen. And it would seem, Mr. Hawthorne, that your journey is not meant to end in the past. A beat of silence passed. Then, Eldrick took a deep, shuddering breath and nodded. Then I stay. Harry grinned. That settles it, then. McGonagall exhaled, rubbing the bridge of her nose. Merlin help us all. But there was no true exasperation in her voice, only a begrudging sort of acceptance. Dumbledore's smile grew. A new beginning, then. And just like that, it was decided. In the following days, things slowly returned to normal, or as normal as they could be after everything that had happened. Eldrick, now officially a resident of this era, was placed under Hogwarts protection while Dumbledore sorted out the technicalities of his existence. He spent most of his time in the library, catching up on centuries of lost knowledge. Luna often visited him, bringing odd books and trinkets, chatting with him as if they had been old friends for years. Harry, ever the problem solver, did his best to help Eldrick integrate. Why? Well, I found myself simply grateful. Grateful that we had made it back. Grateful that, despite everything, we had found a way forward. One evening, as I stood by the great lake, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I heard footsteps behind me. Eldrick. He stood beside me, his hands tucked into the pockets of his robes, his gaze thoughtful. "I wanted to thank you," he said after a moment. I raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For everything," he said simply. He glanced at me, a small, genuine smile on his lips. "If you hadn't pulled me into this, if you hadn't convinced me to keep going, I think I would have stayed in that past forever." I smiled back. "Well, I couldn't just leave you there, could I?" He chuckled softly. "No, I suppose you couldn't." We stood there in comfortable silence, watching the last rays of sunlight dance across the water. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I finally felt at peace. The journey has come to an end. Time has settled, like ripples fading on the surface of a quiet lake. The echoes of the past remain, but the present moves forward, carrying new beginnings with it. Breathe in, feel the stillness. Let the story linger in your mind like a fading dream. Every path we take, every choice we make, shapes the story of who we are. And sometimes, even when we feel lost in time, we find exactly where we're meant to be. Now, let the night embrace you. Let the quiet wrap around you like a warm blanket. Close your eyes, drift into sleep, and let your dreams take you on another journey, wherever time may lead.